You feel stuck in mediocrity, while others around you seem destined for greatness, watching as opportunities slip by because you're waiting for permission to act. Every day you hesitate, someone else with less talent but more audacity seizes the moment you are too cautious to claim, leaving you wondering if you'll ever break free from the ordinary life that's slowly suffocating your potential. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican artillery officer who refused to accept the limits others placed on him and rose to reshape the map of Europe. Through sheer force of will and an unshakable belief in my mission, I transformed a struggling republic into an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, proving that when you act as if you're destined to change history, the world has no choice but to make room for your ambitions. What I discovered about mission-driven action will transform how you approach every goal and challenge in your life, teaching you to move with the same certainty that carried me from the barracks to the throne. The same principles that conquered nations can conquer the hesitation and self-doubt that keep you playing small when you were born to play for empire. But first, like this video, subscribe for more imperial wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to march toward greatness. I was born on an island that refused to kneel, and that spirit of defiance became the foundation of everything I would accomplish. Corsica had been sold to France just months before my birth, but the Corsican blood in my veins carried the memory of independence, the refusal to accept what others declared inevitable. My father, Charles, had fought alongside Pasquale Paoli against French rule, and though he eventually submitted to French authority, he planted seeds of ambition in my mind that would grow into an empire. The other boys at school mocked my accent, called me a foreigner, treated me as less than French, but what they intended as humiliation became my first lesson in the power of mission-driven thinking. While they laughed at my pronunciation, I was studying their weaknesses, learning their patterns, preparing for the day when I would stand above them all. Every insult they hurled at me became fuel for the fire that would eventually consume their mediocrity. I remember the exact moment when I decided I would never again accept what others told me was possible. I was 10 years old, standing in the courtyard of my school in Autumn, surrounded by boys who thought they were my betters because they were born on the mainland. They had cornered me, taunting me about my origins, when something inside me shifted. Instead of shame, I felt a cold, calculating anger that would become my greatest weapon. I looked at their faces, memorized their names, and made a silent promise that would shape the rest of my life. I would rise so high that they would spend their days explaining to their children why they had once dared to mock Napoleon Bonaparte. This wasn't mere revenge fantasy, it was the birth of mission consciousness. The moment when I understood that your response to adversity determines whether you become a victim or a conqueror. That night, I began planning my elevation with the same systematic approach I would later use to plan military campaigns. I studied harder than anyone else, not because I loved learning, but because knowledge was power and power was freedom. I read everything I could find about history's great leaders, searching for the patterns that separated those who changed the world from those who merely inhabited it. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, they all shared one crucial trait. They acted as if their success was inevitable, not hopeful. They didn't wait for permission or favorable circumstances. They created circumstances through the sheer force of their will and the clarity of their vision. I began to understand that mission-driven action wasn't about having a plan, it was about having an unshakable conviction that you were destined for something greater than your current circumstances. What most people call confidence, I learned to recognize as mission clarity. When you know with absolute certainty that you are meant to change history, temporary setbacks become merely tactical adjustments. The mockery of schoolboys becomes irrelevant noise. The limitations others place on you become obstacles to overcome. Rather than boundaries to accept, This is the first principle I want you to understand. Your mission begins the moment you refuse to accept other people's assessment of your potential. Those Corsican fires of defiance that burned within me are the same fires that must burn within you if you truly want to change your world. Asterisk asterisk, when I arrived at the École Militaire in Paris, I carried with me the burning conviction that excellence was not optional, it was the only path to freedom. While other cadets complained about the rigorous mathematics and engineering requirements, I embraced them with the intensity of a man whose life depended on mastery. Because it did. I understood something they didn't. Competence is the foundation upon which all great missions are built. I threw myself into the study of artillery with an obsession that my fellow cadets found peculiar. They saw mathematics as a burden. I saw it as the language of precision that would allow me to reshape battlefields. While they memorized procedures, I absorbed principles. I didn't just learn how to calculate trajectories, I understood why angles and velocities mattered, how weather affected range, why timing determined victory or defeat. The other students thought I was antisocial because I spent my evenings alone with books while they played cards and drank wine. They didn't understand that I wasn't avoiding their company. I was investing in my future dominance. Every hour they wasted in trivial pursuits was an hour I gained in preparation for the moment when preparation would meet opportunity. My instructors noticed my intensity immediately. Where others sought to do just enough to pass, I sought to master every detail until it became instinctive. I read treatises on fortification until I could design siege works in my sleep. I studied the great military campaigns of history until I could predict tactical decisions before I read the outcomes. I wasn't just learning about warfare, I was absorbing the mindset of commanders who had changed the course of nations. This obsessive preparation revealed the second principle of mission-driven action. Excellence creates opportunities that mediocrity can never access. When you become undeniably superior at your craft, doors open that remain forever closed to those who settle for good enough. The universe has a way of placing extraordinary challenges in the path of those who have proven they can handle them. Graduated from the École Militaire in just 1 year instead of the usual 2, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery at the age of 16. But more importantly, I had learned to think like an engineer of victory. I understood that every battle was a problem to be solved through superior knowledge, better preparation, and more precise execution. During my early assignments, while other officers spent their time on social pleasures, I continued my relentless self-education. I read Plutarch's Lives over and over, studying how great leaders thought and acted. I devoured books on political theory, economics, and geography. I wasn't just preparing to be a better artillery officer. I was preparing to understand how power worked, how nations rose and fell, how individual genius could reshape entire civilizations. The garrison life in Valence and Axen could have been a dead end for someone with ordinary ambitions. Remote postings, minimal action, endless routine. Most officers saw these assignments as exile. I saw them as laboratories for developing the skills I would need when my moment came. I used the quiet periods to write, to study, to develop the strategic thinking that would later astonish Europe. This is when I learned the third principle. True mission thinkers use every environment as preparation ground. There are no meaningless assignments when you understand that your current position is training for your ultimate destination. The artillery skills I mastered in those forgotten garrisons would later allow me to revolutionize battlefield tactics. The leadership experience I gained, commanding small units, would later help me inspire entire armies. I was developing what I would later call the artillery of ambition, the precise calculated application of superior knowledge and relentless preparation to break through obstacles that stop ordinary people. Just as artillery concentrates massive force at a single point, to breach the strongest fortifications. Mission-driven individuals concentrate their efforts with surgical precision to achieve breakthrough results. The siege of Toulon was the moment when all my preparation collided with opportunity, and the explosion reshaped my destiny forever. When the Royalist rebellion handed France's most important naval base to the British and Spanish fleets in 1793, the Republic faced a crisis that threatened its very survival. While senior officers debated cautious approaches and conventional strategies, I saw something they missed. This wasn't just a military problem, it was a historical invitation. I was 24 years old, a captain of artillery assigned to what most considered an impossible task. The enemy held Toulon's harbor with the backing of powerful Allied navies, their positions seemingly impregnable behind massive fortifications. Previous attempts to retake the city had failed miserably, and morale among Republican forces was crumbling. This was exactly the kind of situation where ordinary thinking produces ordinary defeats. But I had spent years studying the geometry of warfare, and I could see what the senior commanders couldn't. They were attacking the wrong objective. While they focused on the city walls and harbor defenses, I identified the key terrain that would make all other positions untenable. Fort Le Guillet commanded the harbor entrance, capture that high ground, and the enemy fleet would be forced to withdraw, making the entire defensive position collapse. When I presented my plan to the commanding general, he initially dismissed it as the fantasy of an overeager young officer. This was my first lesson in how mediocrity resists innovation, even when innovation offers salvation. Conventional minds cannot comprehend breakthrough thinking because breakthrough thinking operates on principles they've never mastered. I didn't argue or plead. Instead, I demonstrated the fourth principle of mission-driven action. When words fail, let results speak. I requested permission to position my artillery according to my tactical assessment, promising specific outcomes within specific timeframes. I staked my career on my analysis, because that's what mission-conscious leaders do. They bet everything on their preparation and conviction. The bombardment I designed was unlike anything the enemy expected. Instead of the predictable assault on obvious targets, I concentrated devastating fire on the positions that controlled the entire strategic picture. Every shot was calculated for maximum psychological and tactical impact. I wasn't just trying to damage enemy positions. I was systematically dismantling their ability to maintain coherent defense. Within days, my artillery had made Fort Le Guillet untenable. The British and Spanish fleets, unable to remain in a harbor dominated by Republican guns, began their withdrawal. As I had predicted, the entire enemy position unraveled once their key terrain was lost. Toulon fell to the Republic, and overnight I became the youngest general in French history. But the real victory wasn't my promotion. It was the validation of mission-driven thinking over conventional wisdom. While others had seen an impossible siege, I had seen a geometric problem with a mathematical solution. While they worried about what couldn't be done, I focused on what must be done and found the way to do it. The aftermath of Toulon taught me the fifth principle: dramatic success attracts both opportunities and enemies. My rapid elevation made me powerful allies among those who recognized talent, but it also created resentment among officers who had advanced through seniority rather than achievement. I learned that breakthrough performance disrupts established hierarchies and threatens those who benefit from mediocrity. This is why mission-driven individuals must develop what I call strategic patience, the ability to consolidate gains before advancing to the next level. After Toulon, I could have pushed for immediate advancement to higher commands, but I understood that sustainable success requires time to build the relationships and reputation that support continued ascent. The recognition from Toulon opened doors that would have remained closed for decades under normal advancement. Political leaders began seeking my opinions on military strategy. Fellow officers started studying my methods. Most importantly, I gained the confidence that comes from proving your theories under the ultimate test, life and death combat, where failure means destruction. This is the moment when mission thinking transforms from internal conviction to external reality, when your preparation meets the right opportunity and produces undeniable results. You stop being someone with potential and become someone with proven power to change outcomes. Asterisk. When I took command of the army of Italy in 1796, I inherited what most generals would consider an impossible situation. My soldiers were demoralized, poorly equipped, and months behind on pay. They faced a coalition of Austrian and Piedmontese forces that outnumbered them significantly and held superior positions throughout northern Italy. The Directory in Paris expected little more than a holding action to prevent complete collapse. I saw something entirely different. Where others saw weakness, I saw concentrated potential waiting for the right catalyst. These weren't defeated soldiers, they were frustrated warriors who had never been properly led. What they lacked in resources, they possessed in desperate energy that could be channeled into unstoppable momentum. I understood the sixth principle of mission-driven leadership. Transformation begins with seeing possibilities that others miss. My first action was to address my soldiers directly, without the formal distance that characterized military communication. I looked into their eyes and spoke to their hunger for significance rather than their fear of defeat. I told them we would march fast, strike hard, and become rich through victory rather than poor through prolongation. I painted a vision where their current suffering would become the foundation of legendary triumph. But inspiration without strategy is merely motivation. And motivation fades when reality strikes. I had spent months studying the geography of northern Italy, understanding how the alpine terrain created natural corridors that could be exploited by a force willing to move with unprecedented speed, while my enemies planned ponderous campaigns based on conventional wisdom. I designed lightning strikes that would shatter their assumptions about warfare. The campaign that followed demonstrated the seventh principle: speed transforms weakness into strength. Instead of fighting the combined Austrian and Piedmontese armies simultaneously, I used rapid movement to engage them separately, concentrating superior force at decisive points while they remained divided and confused about my intentions. At Montenot, I struck the Austrian corps with overwhelming local superiority before they could coordinate with their allies. At Millesimo, I crushed the Piedmontese forces while the Austrians were still marching to support them. Each victory built momentum that multiplied the psychological impact of the next engagement. My enemies began to fear the speed of my movements more than the size of my army. What amazed observers was how soldiers who had been dejected and rebellious weeks earlier were now fighting with fanatical devotion. They had discovered something that transforms ordinary people into extraordinary performers. The intoxicating power of being part of a mission that transcends individual concerns. When people believe they are participating in something historically significant, they access reserves of energy and courage they never knew they possessed. I learned to communicate victory before it happened, creating the psychological conditions that made victory inevitable. When we approached each battle, I spoke to my soldiers not about the possibility of winning, but about the specific ways we would win and what that victory would mean for their legacy. I taught them to see themselves as instruments of historical change, rather than merely participants in tactical engagements. The Battle of Lodi became legendary not because of its strategic importance, but because of how it demonstrated the power of personal example in mission-driven leadership. When the Austrian artillery commanded the bridge that we needed to cross, I personally sighted the guns that silenced their battery. My soldiers saw their general sharing the same risks they faced, and it welded them to me with loyalty that would endure through decades of campaigning. This taught me the eighth principle. Leaders who demand extraordinary effort must model extraordinary commitment. You cannot inspire others to sacrifice for a mission unless they see you sacrificing more than you ask from them. Leadership in pursuit of transformational goals requires the leader to embody the intensity they seek to create in others. Within weeks, we had driven the Austrians out of most of northern Italy and forced Piedmont to seek a separate peace. The army of Italy had transformed from a demoralized rabble into a victorious force that struck terror into the heart of European monarchies. But more importantly, I had learned how to take a group of individuals with ordinary capabilities and forge them into an instrument capable of achieving impossible results. The key was understanding that people will endure any hardship and overcome any obstacle when they believe their efforts serve a purpose greater than personal comfort. Mission-driven leadership isn't about making things easier for your people. It's about making their struggles meaningful by connecting individual effort to historical significance. By the end of the Italian campaign, my soldiers called me La Petit Caporal, the little corporal, not in mockery, but in recognition that I shared their dangers while leading them to triumphs they had never imagined possible. They understood that following me meant accepting hardship, but also participating in the kind of glory that most people only read about in history books. Asterisk, asterisk, after conquering northern Italy, I faced a choice that would define whether I was merely a successful general or a builder of lasting legacy. The Directory offered me command of the invasion of England, a conventional military objective that promised either glorious victory or spectacular defeat. Instead, I proposed something that seemed impossible, an expedition to Egypt that would combine conquest with scientific discovery, military glory with cultural transformation. Most of my colleagues thought I had lost my mind. Egypt was a remote Ottoman province with no apparent strategic value to France. The logistical challenges of projecting force across the Mediterranean were enormous. The risks of being cut off from France by British naval power were obvious. But I saw what they couldn't. Egypt was the crossroads where European ambition could meet Eastern wisdom, where military achievement could be elevated to civilizational significance. This decision taught me the ninth principle of mission action. Truly transformational goals appear impossible to conventional thinking precisely because they operate on a different scale of vision. When you think in terms of decades rather than years, of cultural impact rather than immediate gain, opportunities become visible that remain hidden to those focused on quarterly results. I didn't just plan a military campaign, I designed a civilizational encounter. Along with 35,000 soldiers, I brought 167 scholars, scientists, and artists whose mission was to unlock the secrets of ancient Egypt, while my army secured French dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. This wasn't conquest. For its own sake, it was conquest in service of expanding human knowledge and French cultural influence. The scholars I selected weren't decorative additions to a military expedition. They were essential components of a mission that aimed to demonstrate French intellectual superiority alongside military power. I understood that lasting influence requires more than the ability to win battles. It requires the capacity to reshape how people think about the world and their place in it. When we landed at Alexandria, I addressed my soldiers with words that connected their immediate tactical objectives to the sweep of history itself. I reminded them that they were following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, that the pyramids looking down upon them had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that their actions would determine whether France joined the ranks of nations that had left permanent marks upon human civilization. The Battle of the Pyramids demonstrated how mission-driven leadership can transform ordinary soldiers into instruments of historical destiny. Facing the Mamluk cavalry that had dominated Egypt for centuries, my square formations held firm, not just because of superior tactics, but because every man understood that defeat would mean the failure of an enterprise that transcended military objectives. But Egypt taught me something even more important than military lessons. It revealed the power of systematic knowledge acquisition in pursuit of mission objectives. While my army secured territory, my scholars were unlocking secrets that had been buried for millennia. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during our occupation wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate effort to understand and document everything we encountered. I spent countless hours with the scholars, learning about ancient Egyptian engineering, governance, and culture. I wasn't merely curious, I was studying how great civilizations had sustained themselves across centuries, what principles of organization and leadership had allowed them to build monuments that still inspired awe after thousands of years. This taught me the 10th principle: mission-driven leaders must be systematic learners who extract wisdom from every environment they encounter. Egypt wasn't just a place to conquer, it was a laboratory for understanding how power, knowledge, and cultural influence combined to create lasting impact. The scientific work we accomplished in Egypt produced the description de l'Egypte, a comprehensive documentation of Egyptian culture and history that influenced European understanding for generations. We didn't just defeat the Mamelukes, we revealed Egypt to the modern world, demonstrating that French intellectual achievement could match French military prowess, even when Nelson's victory at the Battle of the Nile cut our naval communications. With France, I refused to see the situation as desperate isolation. Instead, I recognized it as an opportunity to demonstrate how mission-driven leadership adapts to changing circumstances without abandoning core objectives. Cut off from direct support, we became more resourceful, more innovative, more dependent on our own capabilities. The experience of leading a combined military and scientific expedition in a foreign land taught me that the most ambitious missions require the integration of multiple types of excellence. Military power without intellectual achievement is mere brutality. Scientific discovery without the force to protect and propagate it remains academic curiosity. But when you combine superior fighting capability with systematic knowledge acquisition, you create the foundation for influence that outlasts any individual campaign. When I eventually returned to France, leaving the army in Egypt under other commanders, I brought back more than military experience. I returned with a deeper understanding of how great leaders throughout history had combined immediate tactical success with long-term strategic vision, how they had used military achievement as a platform for cultural and intellectual advancement. When I returned from Egypt in October 1799, I found France drowning in political chaos and military defeats. The directory that had sent me to Egypt was crumbling under the weight of its own incompetence. Military disasters on multiple fronts were draining the nation's strength, and the revolutionary ideals that had inspired a generation were degenerating into factional violence and corruption. While others saw only crisis, I recognized the moment I had been preparing for my entire adult life. This is when I learned the 11th principle of mission-driven action. Great leaders don't wait for ideal circumstances. They recognize when circumstances are ready for transformation and act decisively to shape the outcome. Revolutionary moments are always chaotic, always uncertain, always dangerous, but they are also when determined individuals with clear vision can reshape entire nations. The conspiracy that became the coup of 18 Brumaire wasn't my idea initially. I was approached by politicians like Abbé Sieyès and others who were desperate to stabilize France but lacked the force of personality and military credibility to make their vision reality. They needed a general with popular support and proven competence. What they didn't understand was that I needed them only as a temporary means to an end that stretched far beyond their limited political imagination. I agreed to participate, not because I sought to serve their agenda, but because I recognized how their immediate objectives could serve my ultimate mission. They wanted to replace the failing directory with a more stable government. I wanted to create the foundation for transforming France into the dominant power in Europe. Our short-term interests aligned, but our long-term visions were completely different. The actual execution of the coup revealed how preparation and calculation must combine with adaptability and nerve when mission-critical moments arrive. The original plan was for me to address the legislature at St. Cloud and convince them to voluntarily transfer power to a new executive structure. What the conspirators hadn't anticipated was the fierce resistance we would encounter from deputies who suspected our true intentions. When I entered the chamber and attempted to speak, I was shouted down by legislators who accused me of seeking to establish a military dictatorship. The situation became so hostile that I was physically threatened and had to be escorted from the hall. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The conspiracy could have collapsed, leaving me exposed as a failed plotter against the Republic. This was the test that separates true mission-driven leaders from those who merely dream of greatness. When your carefully laid plans encounter unexpected resistance, when the moment of decision arrives and everything depends on your response to circumstances you didn't anticipate, you discover what you're truly made of. I didn't retreat or negotiate or seek compromise. Instead, I appealed directly to the military force that had always been the ultimate arbiter of power in revolutionary France. I ordered my brother, Lucien, who was presiding over the legislature, to declare that the Republic was in danger from internal enemies. I commanded my grenadiers to clear the Chamber of Deputies who refused to cooperate with our new order. Within hours, the directory ceased to exist, and the consulate was established with me as first consul. What began as a political conspiracy to stabilize the government had become the foundation for my rise to supreme power in France. But this transformation didn't happen by accident. It resulted from my understanding of how to use other people's limited objectives to achieve unlimited personal goals. The coup taught me the 12th principle. When you participate in transformational moments, you must be prepared to exceed the expectations of those who initially invite your participation. The politicians who approached me wanted a general who would lend credibility to their constitutional reforms. What they got was a leader who used their invitation as authorization to reshape France according to his own vision. Within weeks of the coup's success, it became clear that I had no intention of serving as a mere military figurehead for civilian politicians. I began systematically consolidating power, eliminating potential rivals, and establishing the institutional foundations for what would become the empire. The very people who had brought me to power discovered that they had unleashed forces they could not control. This revealed the 13th principle. Mission-driven individuals must understand that successful transformation often requires exceeding the boundaries that others try to establish. Those who invite your participation in change usually want limited change that preserves their own positions. True transformation requires the courage to go further than anyone expects, including those who initially support you. The coup of 18 Brumaire was successful not just because it removed an ineffective government, but because it created the political foundation for everything I would accomplish over the next 15 years. It demonstrated that when preparation meets opportunity and is executed with decisive action, individual vision can reshape the destiny of nations. While Europe focused on my military campaigns and political maneuvering, I was quietly engineering a transformation that would outlast every battlefield victory I ever achieved. The creation of what became known as the Napoleonic Code wasn't merely legal reform. It was the systematic construction of a new social order that would carry French influence into every corner of the civilized world long after my armies had returned home. Most leaders think in terms of immediate results, winning the next battle, surviving the next crisis, maintaining power through the next political challenge. But I understood the 14th principle of mission-driven achievement. Lasting impact requires building systems that function independently of your personal presence. Military conquest is temporary. Institutional transformation is permanent. When I convened the Commission of Legal Experts to draft a new civil code for France, I didn't delegate the work to scholars and withdraw to other concerns. Instead, I participated directly in the deliberations, attending more than half of the 102 sessions where every article was debated and refined. I understood that law is the architecture of society, and architects must be intimately involved in designing the structures that will house human behavior for generations. The existing legal system in France was a chaotic patchwork of Roman law, Germanic customs, royal ordinances, and revolutionary decrees that often contradicted each other. Citizens in different regions operated under different legal principles, making unified governance impossible and economic development uncertain. I saw this confusion not as an administrative annoyance, but as a fundamental obstacle to creating the kind of rational, efficient society that could compete with other European powers. My vision for the code was revolutionary in its simplicity. Create a legal framework that any citizen could understand, that applied equally regardless of birth or region, and that protected individual rights while maintaining social order. I wanted laws that would encourage economic development, strengthen family structures, and reward merit over inherited privilege. The debates revealed how deeply entrenched interests resist systematic change, even when that change serves the greater good. Traditionalists wanted to preserve aristocratic privileges that had survived the revolution. Religious authorities sought to maintain ecclesiastical influence over civil matters. Revolutionary extremists pushed for radical provisions that would have made the code unworkable in practice. I navigated these competing pressures by maintaining focus on the ultimate objective, creating a legal system that would make France stronger, more prosperous, and more influential. When discussions became bogged down in ideological arguments, I redirected attention to practical consequences. When various factions tried to insert provisions that served their narrow interests, I insisted on principles that served the national interest. The finished code demonstrated the 15th principle of institutional transformation. Enduring systems must balance idealism with pragmatism. Pure ideological consistency produces laws that sound beautiful but don't work in practice. Pure pragmatism creates systems that function but don't inspire. The code succeeded because it embodied revolutionary principles within practical frameworks that ordinary people could understand and use. What amazed contemporary observers was how quickly the code was adopted beyond France's borders. Within decades, legal systems based on Napoleonic principles were functioning throughout Europe, Latin America, and much of the developing world. This wasn't because I imposed the code through military force. It spread because it worked better than existing alternatives. The code's influence revealed the 16th principle. Superior systems propagate themselves through voluntary adoption. When you create institutional innovations that solve universal problems more effectively than existing approaches, other societies will adapt your solutions even if they resist your political influence. The code conquered territory that my armies never reached and survived defeats that ended my political power. I spent countless hours reviewing specific provisions, understanding that details matter as much as general principles in legal construction. The sections on property rights, contracts, and family relations weren't abstract legal theory, they were practical tools for organizing human behavior in ways that would strengthen French society and extend French influence. The experience of Creating the code taught me something crucial about the relationship between power and permanence. Military victories create temporary dominance that lasts only as long as you can maintain superior force. Political achievements endure only as long as political circumstances remain favorable. But institutional innovations that improve how societies function become part of the permanent structure of human civilization. This is why I've always said that my true glory lies not in having won 40 battles, but in the code that bears my name. Waterloo erased my military reputation, but the legal principles I established continue governing the lives of millions of people who have never heard of any battle I fought. When you want to change history, focus on building systems that will outlast your personal involvement in implementing them. Asterisk. The moment when I placed the crown of emperor upon my own head in Notre Dame Cathedral wasn't just ceremonial theater, was the ultimate demonstration of self-authorization that every mission-driven individual must master. When Pope Pius VII had traveled from Rome expecting to crown me according to ancient tradition, I made a decision that shocked Europe and revealed the 17th principle of transformational leadership. You must grant yourself the authority that others are reluctant to give. For 1,000 years, European monarchs had received legitimacy from external sources: papal blessing, hereditary succession, or military conquest validated by existing power structures. I understood that accepting traditional forms of authorization would limit my power to traditional boundaries. If the Pope crowned me, I would be seen as holding power through religious sanction. If I claimed legitimacy through hereditary right, I would be bound by aristocratic conventions. Neither path served my mission of fundamentally transforming European civilization. By crowning myself, I declared that my authority came from my own achievements, my own vision, and my own capacity to improve the lives of the French people. This wasn't arrogance, it was strategic communication designed to establish a new principle of legitimacy based on merit rather than birth, performance rather than tradition. The ceremony itself demonstrated how to use symbols and spectacle to reinforce mission-driven narratives. Every detail was calculated to project power, legitimacy, and historical significance. I wore robes that combined Roman imperial symbolism with French royal tradition, creating visual continuity with past greatness while establishing my unique position. The presence of foreign dignitaries, military officers, and religious authorities communicated that my elevation had broad support across different sectors of society. But the most important audience for the coronation wasn't the assembled dignitaries, it was the French people, who needed to see that their support of my rise had been validated by the highest possible recognition. The coronation transformed me from a successful general who had seized power into a legitimate emperor whose authority was recognized throughout Europe. This taught me the 18th principle: mission-driven leaders must understand how to use ceremony and symbolism to solidify transformations that began with practical achievement. Raw power without ceremonial validation remains vulnerable to challenge, but power that has been publicly recognized and formally invested becomes part of the accepted order that others hesitate to disrupt. The decision to crown Josephine immediately after crowning myself revealed another crucial insight about power consolidation. By making her empress, I wasn't just honoring our personal relationship, I was demonstrating that my new order would respect and elevate those who had supported my rise. This sent a powerful message to other allies that loyalty to my mission would be rewarded with advancement and recognition. The international reaction to my coronation proved the 19th principle: bold demonstrations of self-authorization either intimidate opponents into acceptance or force them to reveal their hostility openly. European monarchies were horrified by the precedent I had established, the idea that merit and achievement could create legitimate authority. without traditional validation, threatened the foundations of their own power. But their horror was mixed. With reluctant admiration, I had accomplished what they had never imagined possible, transforming myself from a provincial artillery officer into the Emperor of France through sheer force of will and superior performance. Even my enemies had to acknowledge that I had demonstrated capabilities that hereditary monarchs rarely possessed. The coronation also marked the moment when I had to transition from revolutionary leader to imperial ruler. During my rise to power, I could appeal to people's desire for change and their frustration with existing limitations. As emperor, I had to demonstrate that my new order could deliver stability, prosperity, and glory more effectively than traditional monarchies. This transition required mastering the 20th principle. Mission-driven leaders must evolve from agents of change into architects of improved order. Destruction of old systems is only valuable if it creates space for superior new systems. Revolution without constructive follow-through produces chaos rather than progress. The crown I placed on my head wasn't just a symbol of personal achievement. It was a commitment to use imperial power in service of the civilizational mission that had motivated me since my youth in Corsica. I wasn't crowning myself to satisfy personal vanity, but to establish the institutional foundation for spreading French influence and French principles throughout Europe and beyond. The ceremony in Notre Dame represented the culmination of 15 years of systematic preparation and strategic advancement, from the artillery officer who had impressed his superiors with technical competence, through the general who had demonstrated tactical genius in Italy and Egypt, to the first consul who had stabilized France after revolutionary chaos. Every stage had built toward this moment of ultimate authorization. But I understood that the coronation was not an ending, it was the beginning of the phase, where I would discover whether my imperial vision could transform European civilization as dramatically as my military genius had transformed European warfare. Asterisk. December 2nd, 1805, the anniversary of my coronation, became the day when I demonstrated that strategic genius could achieve results that bordered on the miraculous. The Battle of Austerlitz wasn't just a military victory, it was the perfect execution of everything I had learned about preparation, deception, timing, and the psychology of warfare. When the sun set on that battlefield, I had not only defeated the combined armies of Austria and Russia, but proven that superior thinking could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The campaign that led to Austerlitz began with what appeared to be a strategic disaster. The coalition assembled against France was the most formidable in European history. Austria, Russia, Britain, and smaller allies had coordinated their efforts with unprecedented determination. Their armies outnumbered mine significantly, and they held the initiative of choosing when and where to fight. Conventional military wisdom suggested that France faced inevitable defeat, but I had learned the 21st principle of mission strategy. Apparent disadvantages can become decisive advantages when you understand how to manipulate your opponent's perceptions and reactions. Instead of trying to match the coalition's numerical superiority, I designed a campaign that would turn their strengths against them through strategic deception and tactical surprise. The key insight was recognizing that large coalitions are inherently unstable because different allies have different objectives and different tolerance for casualties. The Austrians wanted to recover territory they had lost in previous wars. The Russians sought to establish their influence in Central Europe. Neither was prepared for the kind of sustained, costly warfare that would be necessary to completely destroy French power. I began by appearing weaker than I actually was. When the Austrians advanced into Bavaria, expecting to link up with Russian reinforcements, I concentrated my forces with unprecedented speed and struck them at Ulm before the junction could be completed. The entire Austrian army was surrounded. and forced to surrender without the Russians even knowing a battle had been fought. This demonstrated the 22nd principle. Speed and concentration of force can create local superiority even when facing overall numerical disadvantage. While my enemies were thinking in terms of grand strategic combinations, I was focused on operational details that would allow me to defeat them piecemeal before they could combine their strength. After EOM, I faced a new challenge. The Russian army under Kutuzov was retreating eastward, trying to link up with Austrian reinforcements and additional Russian corps arriving from the homeland. I could have pursued them immediately, but that would have meant fighting on ground of their choosing at a time when their forces were concentrated and mine were extended. Instead, I implemented a deception that has become legendary in military history. I deliberately appeared to be in a weaker position than I actually occupied, even abandoning the commanding heights of the Pratzen Plateau and seeming to concentrate my forces in defensive positions. When the Allied commanders saw this apparent weakness, they convinced themselves that they could achieve a decisive victory by seizing the high ground. I had evacuated. The night before the battle, I walked among my soldiers, sharing their campfires, and speaking with them about the anniversary of my coronation. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just another engagement, it was the battle that would determine whether the empire we had built together would survive and prosper, or be dismembered by jealous monarchies. This revealed the 23rd principle. Leaders must personally embody the confidence they want to inspire in others during mission-critical moments. My soldiers needed to see that I was calm, prepared, and certain of victory despite facing numerically superior enemies. Leadership during decisive battles requires projecting absolute confidence, even when the outcome remains uncertain. When dawn broke on December 2nd, everything unfolded exactly as I had planned. The Allies attacked the positions they thought I was defending desperately, only to discover that I had deliberately weakened those sectors to draw them into overextension. While they committed their reserves to what they believed was a breakthrough, I launched my main attack against the Pratzen Plateau they had abandoned to support their offensive. The Battle of Austerlitz became a masterpiece of tactical coordination. Every corps moved according to precisely timed instructions that had been developed during months of preparation. My artillery concentrated devastating fire on enemy formations caught in the open. My cavalry exploited breakthroughs created by infantry assaults. Most importantly, every soldier understood his role in a larger plan that depended on perfect execution of interdependent parts. By afternoon, the Allied armies were in complete retreat. The Austrians had lost most of their effective military power. The Russians were withdrawing toward their own borders. Emperor Francis of Austria was seeking immediate negotiations. Tsar Alexander was learning that Russian military prestige meant nothing against superior French planning and execution. But the real lesson of Austerlitz was the 24th principle. Perfect preparation, combined with superior execution, can produce results that seem impossible to those who don't understand the systematic thinking that made them inevitable. To outside observers, my victory appeared almost magical. How could 68,000 French soldiers defeat 85,000 allies so completely? The answer lay in months of detailed planning, precise intelligence about enemy intentions, careful positioning that created tactical advantages, and the kind of coordinated execution that comes from thoroughly trained and motivated forces, led by commanders who understand every aspect of their mission. Asterisk. After Austerlitz had demonstrated French military supremacy on land, I faced a strategic puzzle that would test whether mission-driven thinking could solve problems that pure military force could not address. Britain remained unconquered, protected by naval superiority that made direct invasion impossible. Traditional warfare had reached its limits. I needed to develop entirely new methods of achieving decisive victory over an enemy I could not directly attack. The continental system that I designed and implemented across Europe represented the 25th Principle of Transformational Strategy. When conventional approaches reach their limits, mission-driven leaders must innovate completely new categories of warfare. I couldn't defeat the British Navy, so I decided to destroy the British economy. I couldn't invade Britain, so I would starve Britain of the trade that sustained its wealth and power. The concept was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. I would use French influence and French military power to close every European port to British commerce. Britain was a commercial nation that depended on exports to survive. If I could cut off their access to continental markets, their economy would collapse and their ability to finance coalitions against France would disappear. What made the continental system revolutionary was its recognition that economic warfare could be more decisive than military warfare when properly coordinated and systematically applied. This wasn't a blockade in the traditional sense. It was the creation of an entire alternative economic system that excluded British participation while strengthening French influence. The implementation of the continental system required me to think like an economist and diplomat as well as a military commander. I had to understand how trade patterns worked, which goods different nations needed most desperately, and how to structure alternatives that would benefit continental European nations while isolating Britain. This taught me the 26th principle. Comprehensive strategies require mastery of multiple disciplines that most leaders never bother to study. Military genius alone wasn't sufficient for implementing the continental system. I needed to become expert in international economics, commercial law, and industrial development. The early results exceeded my most optimistic expectations. British exports to Europe dropped dramatically. British merchants found their traditional markets closed and their warehouses filled with goods they couldn't sell. The British government was forced to seek new markets in distant colonies while dealing with domestic unemployment and industrial disruption. But the continental system also revealed something crucial about the relationship between strategic vision and practical implementation. The most brilliant strategies fail if they require sustained cooperation from allies who don't share your long-term objectives. European nations initially supported the continental system because they feared French military power, but their commitment wavered when they realized the economic costs of excluding British trade. This led to the 27th principle. Transformational strategies must account for the inevitable resistance that emerges when short-term costs become apparent before long-term benefits are realized. People will support dramatic changes enthusiastically at first, but their enthusiasm fades when they discover that transformation requires genuine sacrifice. The challenge of enforcing the continental system across Europe forced me to extend French influence deeper into other nations' internal affairs than I had originally intended. When Portugal refused to close its ports to British ships, I had to occupy Portugal. When Spain's compliance became unreliable, I had to intervene in Spanish politics. When Russian commitment to the system weakened, I began planning the campaign that would ultimately lead to my downfall. Each expansion of French control created new resistance while failing to solve the fundamental problem. The continental system worked only if every significant European power maintained perfect discipline in excluding British commerce. A single major breach would undermine the entire structure by providing Britain with alternative markets and revenue sources. The experience taught me the 28th principle. Strategies that depend on controlling other people's behavior over extended periods are inherently fragile, regardless of how sound the underlying logic appears. You can force compliance through immediate pressure, but sustained compliance requires voluntary cooperation that emerges from shared interests rather than imposed obligations. Despite these challenges, the continental system succeeded in demonstrating that economic warfare could complement military warfare in ways that previous generations of leaders had never imagined. When I combined exclusion of British trade with development of continental European industry, I created the foundation for an integrated European economy that would benefit all participants while establishing French leadership. The continental system also accelerated industrial development throughout Europe by forcing continental nations to develop domestic manufacturing capabilities to replace British imports. This unintended consequence created stronger, more self-sufficient European economies that would ultimately benefit from reduced dependence on British commercial dominance. What I learned from the continental system's partial success and ultimate failure was the 29th principle. Visionary strategies often achieve important objectives even when they don't accomplish their primary goals. The economic integration and industrial development that resulted from the continental system laid groundwork for European prosperity that continued long after the system itself had been abandoned. Asterisk. The relationship between personal passion and historical mission became one of the most complex challenges I faced throughout my rise to imperial power. My marriage to Josephine wasn't just a romantic attachment, it was a case study in how emotional connections can either fuel or drain the energy required for transformational achievement. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone who seeks to change history while maintaining meaningful human relationships. When I first met Josephine during the chaos of revolutionary Paris, I was immediately captivated by her sophistication, her connections to influential political circles, and her ability to navigate the complex social dynamics that I, as a young Corsican officer, found mysterious and intimidating. She represented everything I aspired to become: elegantly French, politically connected, comfortable in the highest levels of society. But what began as infatuation evolved into something more complex as my own power and confidence grew. I discovered the 30th principle of mission-driven relationships. Partnerships that begin as learning opportunities must evolve into mutual support systems, or they become obstacles to continued growth. The woman who had once elevated my social status eventually became someone whose limitations constrained my expanding vision. During the Italian campaigns, I wrote to Josephine with a passion that amazed my officers and worried my political advisors. My letters revealed a vulnerability that seemed incompatible with the iron determination I displayed in military planning. Critics suggested that emotional distraction was undermining my strategic focus, but they misunderstood the relationship between personal passion and professional excellence. The truth was more nuanced. The emotional intensity I felt for Josephine taught me about the power of total commitment that I later applied to military and political objectives. When you love someone completely, you understand what it means to invest everything in pursuit of a single goal. This experience of absolute dedication became a template for the kind of focused intensity that transformational missions require. However, I also learned the 31st principle. Personal relationships must enhance rather than compete with your primary mission, or they will eventually force you to choose between love and legacy. The energy that emotional turmoil consumes could otherwise be directed toward achieving objectives that serve larger purposes than personal satisfaction. Josephine's inability to provide me with an heir created a conflict that revealed the difference between personal desires and dynastic responsibilities. As emperor, I needed to establish a succession that would preserve the institutional changes I had implemented in France. My love for Josephine had to be weighed against my obligation to ensure that the empire would survive beyond my own lifetime. This dilemma taught me something profound about the nature of leadership at the highest levels. Personal happiness becomes a luxury that you may have to sacrifice in service of objectives that transcend individual fulfillment. The decision to divorce Josephine and marry Marie Louise of Austria wasn't about replacing one woman with another. It was about choosing between personal attachment and historical responsibility. The process of making this choice revealed the 32nd principle. Mission-driven leaders must develop the capacity to make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate emotional preferences. The most painful choices are often the most necessary ones when you understand that your personal decisions affect the lives of millions of people who depend on your leadership. My marriage to Marie-Louise demonstrated how personal relationships could be structured to serve strategic objectives while still providing emotional satisfaction. She was young, intelligent, politically valuable as the daughter of the Austrian emperor, and capable of bearing the sons who would continue the Napoleonic dynasty. The relationship combined personal affection with political utility in ways that strengthened, rather than complicated, my imperial mission. But the contrast between my two marriages also revealed something important about the evolution of individuals. The passionate, consuming love I felt for Josephine reflected my younger self's need for validation and emotional security. The more measured, strategic affection I developed for Marie-Louise reflected my mature understanding that personal relationships must serve larger purposes than emotional gratification. This evolution taught me the 33rd principle: as your mission grows in scope and importance, your approach to personal relationships must become more sophisticated and strategic. You can't afford emotional investments that drain energy from world-changing objectives, but you also can't achieve sustained excellence without meaningful human connections that provide support and renewal. The birth of my son with Marie-Louise validated the strategic dimension of our marriage while providing the personal satisfaction that comes from ensuring dynastic continuity. Little Napoleon represented the successful integration of personal fulfillment with historical responsibility, a living symbol that my mission would continue beyond my own lifetime. Understanding how to balance emotional needs with mission requirements isn't about becoming coldly calculating, it's about learning to structure your personal life in ways that support rather than undermine your capacity for extraordinary achievement. Love enhances mission when it provides energy and stability. Love undermines mission when it creates conflicts that distract from essential objectives. The decision to invade Russia in 1812 was the moment when my greatest strength, the absolute confidence that had carried me from Corsica to the throne of Europe, became my greatest weakness. For 15 years, mission-driven thinking had enabled me to achieve impossible results by refusing to accept conventional limitations. But Russia taught me the 34th principle: even the most successful patterns of thought become dangerous when they prevent you from recognizing situations where different approaches are required. The origins of the Russian campaign lay in Tsar Alexander's gradual withdrawal from the continental system. After initially cooperating with French economic warfare against Britain, Russian merchants were demanding access to British markets that provided essential revenue for their grain exports. Alexander was caught between his commitment to our alliance and the economic pressures that threatened to destabilize his own empire. A more cautious leader might have sought diplomatic solutions, or accepted that the continental system had reached the limits of its effectiveness. But I had become accustomed to solving intractable problems through the application of superior force and strategic audacity. Every previous challenge had yielded to systematic pressure and overwhelming commitment. Why should Russia be different? This confidence was reinforced by the apparent strength of my position in 1812. I commanded the largest army ever assembled in European history, over 600,000 men, drawn from France and allied nations across the continent. My military reputation was at its zenith, following victories that had established French dominance from Spain to Poland. The institutional foundations of my power had never been stronger, but success had created a subtle transformation in my thinking that I didn't recognize until it was too late. The mission-driven principles that had guided my rise were gradually being overwhelmed by what I now understand was mission obsession. The inability to distinguish between necessary objectives and unnecessary risks The invasion of Russia wasn't required to preserve French security or maintain the continental system. It was driven by my psychological need to prove that no challenge was beyond my capacity to overcome. When someone has achieved the impossible repeatedly, he begins to believe that the impossible doesn't exist, a delusion that leads to catastrophic miscalculation. This taught me the 35th principle. Mission-driven leaders must maintain the capacity for strategic restraint, even when they possess the power to attempt anything they can imagine. The ability to act decisively must be balanced by the wisdom to recognize when action will create more problems than it solves. The campaign began with the kind of strategic brilliance that had characterized my earlier successes. The speed and coordination of our advance deep into Russian territory caught the enemy commanders off guard and prevented them from organizing effective resistance before we had penetrated hundreds of miles beyond their borders. My plan was to force a decisive battle close to the frontier where superior French tactics could destroy Russian military power before winter arrived. But the Russians implemented a strategy that I should have anticipated but somehow failed to prepare for adequately. Instead of standing and fighting according to conventional military logic, they traded space for time, withdrawing deeper into their vast territory while avoiding the kind of concentrated engagement that would have allowed me to achieve decisive victory through superior battlefield performance. Kutuzov understood something about the relationship between geography and strategy that I had underestimated. Russia's enormous size meant that even massive military success, in particular battles, wouldn't necessarily translate into strategic victory. If the enemy retained the ability to continue resistance from positions beyond the reach of sustainable logistics as we advanced deeper into Russia, I faced a series of choices that revealed how mission obsession distorts judgment. Each day of pursuit took us further from our supply bases and closer to the onset of winter. The prudent decision would have been to establish winter quarters and resume operations the following spring when conditions favored offensive action. But I had become psychologically unable to accept anything less than complete success within the original time frame I had established. The same determination that had enabled me to achieve extraordinary results in Italy, Egypt, and Central Europe now prevented me from adapting to circumstances that required flexible response rather than relentless pressure. The burning of Moscow was the moment when I should have recognized that the campaign had moved beyond the realm where traditional military victory was possible. When the Russians destroyed their own ancient capital rather than allow me to use it as a base for negotiating their surrender, they demonstrated a level of commitment that exceeded anything I had encountered in previous wars. This revealed the 36th principle. Mission-driven leaders must distinguish between opponents who will eventually submit to superior force and opponents whose core values make submission impossible regardless of the costs they must endure. Some conflicts cannot be resolved through the application of overwhelming power, because the enemy's willingness to sacrifice exceeds your capacity to inflict suffering. The retreat from Moscow became a masterclass in how accumulated strategic errors compound into systemic catastrophe. The army that had entered Russia as the most powerful force in European history disintegrated under the combined pressure of Russian harassment, supply shortages, and weather conditions that turned every day of movement into a struggle for survival. By the time we recrossed the Russian frontier, I had lost not just an army but something more precious, the aura of invincibility that had been my most powerful strategic weapon. European nations that had submitted to French dominance because they believed resistance was futile now understood that even Napoleon Bonaparte could be defeated when he overextended himself beyond the limits of practical possibility. Asterisk. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813 was the moment when I discovered what happens when the foundation of your power, the loyalty of allies, and the fear of enemies crumbles simultaneously under the weight of accumulated strategic mistakes. After the Russian disaster, I had managed to rebuild a substantial army and win several tactical victories against individual coalition members. But Leipzig taught me the 37th principle. There comes a moment in every great mission when past errors converge into present crises, and no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome strategic insolvency. The coalition assembled against me at Leipzig was unlike anything I had faced before. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden had coordinated their efforts with unprecedented unity, learning from their previous defeats to avoid the mistakes that had allowed me to defeat them separately. More ominously, several of my former allies, Württemberg and other German states, had switched sides, recognizing that French dominance was no longer inevitable. This defection of allies revealed something crucial about the psychology of power relationships. Nations and individuals support mission-driven leaders as long as association with those leaders enhances their own position and prospects. But when the leader's trajectory shifts from ascending to declining, self-interest demands reconsidering. Those alliances, loyalty based on expedience, evaporates the moment expedience points in a different direction. The Battle of Nations, as Leipzig came to be known, lasted for days and involved over 500,000 soldiers, the largest engagement in European history up to that point. I commanded approximately 190,000 men against coalition forces that eventually numbered over 300,000. The numerical disadvantage was substantial, but I had overcome similar odds before through superior positioning, better coordination, and the psychological impact of French military reputation. What made Leipzig different was the quality of opposition I faced. The coalition commanders had studied my previous victories obsessively, understanding how I used speed and concentration to defeat larger armies by engaging them piecemeal. They refused to be drawn into the kind of separate engagements that had given me decisive advantages at Austerlitz and Jena. Instead, they coordinated their attacks to prevent me from achieving local superiority at any decisive point. The first day of battle demonstrated that my tactical genius remained intact. Despite being outnumbered, French forces held their positions and even achieved limited success in several sectors. My artillery continued to demonstrate superior technical performance, and my veterans fought with the kind of disciplined courage that had made them legendary throughout Europe. But by the second day, the strategic reality became unavoidable. I was fighting a battle of attrition against enemies who could afford losses that would cripple my ability to continue resistance. Every French casualty represented irreplaceable experience and training. Every coalition casualty could be replaced by fresh reinforcements, arriving daily from multiple directions. This taught me the 38th principle. Tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic impossibility when resource disparities become overwhelming. Individual brilliance has limits when confronting systematic opposition that has learned to neutralize your advantages while maximizing their own. The third day brought the defection that shattered any remaining hope of victory. The Saxon corps that had been fighting as part of my army suddenly turned their weapons against their former allies and began attacking French positions. In the chaos of a massive battle, distinguishing between friend and enemy became impossible. When former allies became active opponents without warning, the psychological impact of this betrayal was devastating. My soldiers, who had maintained discipline and courage despite overwhelming odds, suddenly found themselves fighting enemies who knew their positions, their plans, and their weaknesses intimately. Trust, which is the foundation of military effectiveness, disappeared in an instant when you could no longer be certain which units would remain loyal. The fourth day was dedicated to organizing a retreat that would preserve as much of my remaining army as possible. This required accepting the 39th principle. Mission-driven leaders must master the art of strategic withdrawal when continued engagement threatens to transform temporary defeat into permanent destruction. Knowing when to fight and knowing when to withdraw are equally important skills for anyone pursuing transformational objectives. The retreat from Leipzig was conducted with the same systematic precision that had characterized my most successful offensive operations. Despite the chaos of defeat and the constant pressure of pursuing enemies, I managed to extract approximately 100,000 men from what could have been complete annihilation. This remnant would form the core of the forces that would continue resistance during the following year, but Leipzig marked the end of French dominance in Central Europe and the beginning of the final phase of my imperial career. The aura of invincibility that had been my most powerful weapon was permanently broken. European nations that had submitted to French influence out of fear now understood that sustained resistance could achieve victory against even the most formidable opponents. The personal lesson of Leipzig was even more profound than the strategic consequences. I learned that mission-driven individuals must prepare psychologically for the moment when external circumstances will test their internal commitment more severely than any previous challenge. When everything you have built begins to crumble, your response to crisis determines whether you emerge with honor intact or allow desperation to compromise the principles that guided your rise. Leipzig taught me that defeat, when faced with dignity and strategic wisdom, can be more instructive than victory. The leader who learns from comprehensive failure often emerges stronger than the leader who has never been tested by genuine adversity. But this learning requires the humility to acknowledge mistakes and the courage to continue pursuing your mission even when the probability of conventional success has disappeared. Asterisk. When the carriages carried me toward the Mediterranean port where I would board the ship to Elba, I faced the ultimate test of mission-driven thinking. How do you maintain purpose and vision when stripped of all external power and confined to a tiny island that most Europeans couldn't locate on a map? The 10 months I spent ruling Elba taught me the 40th principle. True mission consciousness survives the loss of traditional power because it derives from internal conviction rather than external circumstances. The treaty that sent me to Elba was designed to be a comfortable prison that would keep me occupied with harmless administrative duties while ensuring I could never again threaten European stability. I was granted sovereignty over an island of 12,000 inhabitants, provided with a modest income, and allowed to maintain a token military force of several hundred guards. My enemies believed they had found the perfect solution, exile, that preserved my dignity while eliminating my influence. What they failed to understand was that mission-driven individuals don't derive their sense of purpose from the scale of their immediate responsibilities. The same systematic thinking that had enabled me to transform France could be applied to transforming Elba. The same attention to detail that had revolutionized European warfare could revolutionize island administration. The same vision that had conceived continental empire could conceive island prosperity. Within weeks of my arrival, I was implementing reforms that would have seemed absurd to outside observers, but perfectly logical to anyone who understood that leadership principles remain constant regardless of the size of the territory being governed. I improved the island's roads, developed its mining industry, reformed its legal system, and modernized its defenses. If I was going to rule Elba, then Elba would become the most efficiently governed territory in the Mediterranean. This activity served multiple purposes beyond mere administrative improvement. It maintained my leadership skills at peak effectiveness during a period when those skills might otherwise have atrophied from disuse. It demonstrated to the world that exile hadn't broken my spirit or diminished my capacity for constructive achievement. Most importantly, it preserved my psychological connection to the exercise of power that would be essential if circumstances ever allowed me to resume my larger mission. The months on Elba also provided something I had never possessed during my rise to imperial power: time for systematic reflection on the mistakes that had led to my downfall. without the constant pressure of military campaigns and political crises. I could analyze my strategic decisions with the kind of detached objectivity that's impossible when you're actively engaged in making life or death choices. This analysis taught me the 41st principle: forced pauses in mission pursuit often provide invaluable opportunities for learning and refinement that voluntary reflection rarely achieves. When external circumstances prevent forward progress, wise leaders use the interval to study their past performance and develop improved approaches for future application. I spent countless hours reviewing the decisions that had transformed early successes into ultimate failure. The invasion of Russia had been strategically unnecessary and tactically unsound. The continental system had been conceptually brilliant but practically unenforceable. The treatment of European allies had been extractive rather than collaborative, creating resentment that eventually exploded into coordinated resistance. But perhaps the most important insight from my Elba exile was understanding how success had gradually corrupted my judgment. The mission-driven thinking that had enabled my rise had slowly evolved into mission obsession that prevented me from recognizing when circumstances required adaptation rather than intensification. Victory had made me overconfident, and overconfidence had made me reckless. This recognition led to the 42nd principle. Mission-driven leaders must develop internal mechanisms for maintaining strategic humility, even during periods of extraordinary success. The psychological intoxication of achievement can be more dangerous than the despair of failure, because it prevents the kind of realistic assessment that guides sound decision-making. During the long evenings on Elba, I also studied reports from France with the analytical focus I had once devoted to enemy troop movements. The Bourbon Restoration was proceeding exactly as I had predicted, with incompetence that alienated the very people it was supposed to satisfy. Louis XVIII's government was proving unable to maintain the institutional improvements I had implemented or to provide the kind of dynamic leadership that France had grown accustomed to under my rule. This intelligence gathering wasn't mere curiosity, was systematic preparation for the possibility that circumstances might create an opportunity for return. Mission-driven leaders don't abandon their objectives simply because temporary setbacks make those objectives seem impossible. Instead, they use periods of apparent defeat to prepare for moments when renewed action becomes feasible. The decision to leave Elba and return to France was an impulsive desperation. It was calculated assessment that French political conditions had deteriorated to the point where a restoration of Napoleonic leadership would be welcomed by significant portions of the population. The same strategic thinking that had guided my original rise to power was applied to engineering my return from exile. The 10 months on, Elba had restored my strategic clarity while preserving my operational capabilities. I had learned from my mistakes without being crushed by them. I had maintained my sense of mission while developing more realistic assessments of what that mission could accomplish under changing circumstances. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that my identity and purpose didn't depend on external recognition or conventional measures of success. When I finally boarded the ship that would carry me back to France, I was departing not as a desperate exile, gambling everything on a hopeless venture, but as a mission-driven leader who had used apparent defeat as preparation for renewed achievement. Elba had been intended as my tomb instead. It became my resurrection laboratory. When I stepped onto French soil at Gulf One, on March 1st, 1815, I carried with me nothing but 700 loyal guards and an unshakable conviction that France was ready to restore the glory that Bourbon incompetence had squandered. The march from the Mediterranean coast to Paris became the ultimate demonstration of the 43rd principle. Mission-driven leaders who have genuinely served their people's aspirations can reclaim power through the sheer force of popular recognition, even when they possess no conventional military or political resources. The proclamation I issued upon landing was calculated to remind French citizens of everything they had lost when they allowed foreign powers to impose a king they had never chosen. I didn't appeal to personal loyalty or demand obedience through force. I spoke directly to their hunger for national greatness and their frustration with leaders who seemed more concerned with pleasing European monarchies than advancing French interests. The journey north toward Paris tested every leadership principle I had developed during my rise to imperial power. At each town and village, I faced the possibility that local authorities would arrest me and end my restoration before it could gain momentum. But I understood something about the psychology of popular movements that my enemies had failed to grasp. When people are dissatisfied with existing leadership, they will rally to alternative leadership that promises to restore their sense of dignity and purpose. The first critical test came when I encountered the 5th Regiment of the Line near Grenoble. These soldiers had been sent to arrest me and return me to exile, but I approached them without weapons or guards, speaking directly to their pride as French soldiers and their memories of the victories we had won together. Within minutes, they were shouting "Vive l'Empereur" and joining my march toward the capital. This moment revealed the 44th principle. Authentic leadership creates bonds that survive temporary political arrangements. The soldiers who joined me at Grenoble weren't responding to immediate incentives or coercive pressure. They were responding to their recognition that I represented something essential about French identity, that the Bourbon Restoration had failed to capture. As word of my return spread across France, the response exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Military units sent to stop me instead swelled my ranks. Civil officials appointed by the Bourbon government either fled or declared their renewed allegiance to the empire. Most importantly, the French people demonstrated through their actions that they had never truly accepted the legitimacy of a government imposed by foreign conquest. The speed of my restoration astounded European observers who had convinced themselves that my power had depended solely on military force and political manipulation. They couldn't understand how someone with no army, no treasury, and no institutional support could reclaim control of a major European power within 3 weeks of landing on its shores. But I understood something they didn't. Mission-driven leadership that has genuinely improved people's lives creates a reservoir of loyalty that transcends immediate political circumstances. The French people remembered that under my rule they had been citizens of the most powerful and respected nation in Europe. Under Bourbon rule, they had become subjects of a restored monarchy that seemed more interested in satisfying foreign demands than protecting French dignity. The 100 days that followed my return to Paris demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of mission-driven restoration. On one hand, I was able to rapidly reassemble effective government, rebuild military capabilities, and restore French morale to levels that made renewed European leadership seem possible. The institutional knowledge and popular enthusiasm that had characterized my original rise to power remained available for immediate activation. On the other hand, the circumstances that had originally enabled my success had changed in ways that no amount of personal determination could overcome. European powers were now permanently committed to containing French influence, regardless of who governed France or how efficiently they governed. The coalition arrayed against me possessed resources that exceeded anything I could mobilize. No matter how enthusiastically the French people supported my restoration. This taught me the 45th principle: mission-driven leaders must distinguish between objectives that remain achievable under changed circumstances and objectives that have become impossible regardless of effort and commitment. Courage and determination are essential qualities, but they must be guided by realistic assessment of what can actually be accomplished within existing constraints. The decision to accept battle at Waterloo represented my recognition that the 100 Days could only succeed if I could demonstrate that French military power remained capable of defeating the European coalition. A defensive strategy that preserved my army while avoiding decisive engagement would eventually lead to the same isolation and gradual erosion that had characterized my final years as emperor. But the return from Elba had already achieved something more important than military victory or political restoration. It had proven that mission-driven leadership creates connections with people that survive apparent defeat and can be reactivated when circumstances permit. The French people's response to my return validated 15 years of effort to make France stronger, more prosperous, and more influential than it had ever been under traditional monarchy. The 100 Days also demonstrated that true missions transcend the individuals who initiate them. Even if my personal restoration ultimately failed, the principles I had embodied, merit over birth, rational organization over traditional privilege, national greatness over foreign subservience, had become permanent parts of French consciousness that would influence the nation's development long after my personal career had ended. When I marched toward Waterloo, I understood that I was fighting not just for personal restoration, but for the validation of everything I had attempted to achieve for France and Europe. Victory would prove that mission-driven leadership could overcome any obstacle. Defeat would prove that some historical moments cannot be reclaimed, no matter how powerfully they had originally been seized. June 18th, 1815. Dawned grey and wet across the Belgian countryside near the village of Waterloo, where I would fight the battle that would determine whether my restoration could survive long enough to re-establish French greatness in Europe. As I surveyed the field where Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army awaited my attack, I understood that this engagement would test every principle of mission-driven leadership I had developed during 25 years of warfare and statecraft. The strategic situation was clear. Defeat Wellington's forces before Blucher's Prussians could arrive to reinforce them, then turn to destroy the Prussian army separately. Success would shatter the coalition and force European powers to negotiate with a restored French Empire. From a position of weakness, failure would end my political career permanently and consign France to the status of a second-rate power dominated by foreign influence. The tactical plan was sound and reflected everything I had learned about concentrating superior force at decisive points. Artillery bombardment would weaken Wellington's defensive positions. Cavalry charges would exploit breakthroughs created by infantry assaults. And the Imperial Guard would deliver the final blow that would transform tactical success into strategic victory. But Waterloo taught me the 46th principle. Even perfect planning and flawless execution cannot guarantee success. When multiple variables beyond your control align against you simultaneously, the delayed start due to muddy ground, the stubborn resistance of British infantry that refused to break under pressure that had shattered other armies, the earlier than expected arrival of Prussian reinforcements, one of these factors could have been overcome, but their combination created an impossible situation. The courage of my soldiers at Waterloo was extraordinary. Veterans who had marched from Madrid to Moscow fought with the same disciplined ferocity that had made them legendary throughout Europe. The young guard, middle guard, and finally the old guard itself advanced against positions that conventional wisdom declared impregnable, pressing their attacks with the kind of desperate valor that transcends ordinary military performance. When the old guard, my most elite troops, who had never retreated in battle, finally fell back under overwhelming pressure, I watched 20 years of military supremacy collapse in the space of an hour. But I also witnessed something that reinforced my faith in mission-driven leadership. Soldiers who knew they were facing defeat continued fighting with honor because they understood that how you lose determines what your sacrifice means to history. This revealed the 47th principle. Mission-driven leaders must teach their followers that maintaining dignity and purpose during defeat is as important as achieving victory during success. The Guards' retreat at Waterloo was conducted with the same precision and discipline that had characterized their advances during victorious campaigns. They didn't break or surrender, they withdrew in formation, preserving their honor even as they acknowledged tactical impossibility. The moment when I realized that the battle was irretrievably lost was also the moment when I discovered something crucial about the relationship between personal failure and mission success. My individual career as emperor was ending, but the principles I had championed, merit over privilege, rational organization over traditional chaos, national greatness over foreign domination, would survive my political destruction. As I left the battlefield, I faced the 48th principle: true mission-driven leaders must prepare psychologically for the possibility that their personal involvement in their mission will end before the mission itself is completed. The values and institutions you create can outlast your ability to lead them personally, but only if you have built them on foundations stronger than your individual charisma and capabilities. The ride back to Paris after Waterloo was the longest journey of my life, not because of the physical distance, but because every mile forced me to confront the gap between what I had attempted to achieve and what circumstances had allowed me to accomplish. I had sought to create a European order based on French leadership and rational principles. Instead, I was leaving France once again subject to foreign influence and traditional monarchical restoration. But the defeat at Waterloo also clarified something about the nature of historical significance that success had obscured. I understood that my ultimate legacy would be determined not by whether I had maintained power permanently, but by whether my achievements had permanently changed how people thought about leadership, governance, and national development. The civil code would continue governing the legal relationships of millions of people, regardless of who ruled France. The institutional innovations I had implemented would influence European administration for generations. The principle that careers should be based on merit rather than birth had become so thoroughly established that even restored monarchies would be forced to acknowledge it. Most importantly, I had demonstrated that individuals of extraordinary determination and capability could rise from provincial obscurity to reshape the destiny of continent. This example would inspire future generations of mission-driven leaders who faced their own moments of apparent impossibility. The final lesson of Waterloo was the 49th principle: defeat that is faced with honor and dignity often teaches more valuable lessons than victory that is achieved to eyes. I learned more about leadership, strategy, and the nature of human achievement in the aftermath of Waterloo than I had learned during many of my most celebrated triumphs. When the battle ended and I began my final journey toward exile, I carried with me the knowledge that I had pushed the boundaries of individual achievement as far as circumstances would permit. Not every mission can be completed by the person who initiates it, but every authentic mission contributes to human progress, regardless of whether its originator lives to see its ultimate fulfillment. The island of St. Helena, lying isolated in the South Atlantic, far from any continent, became my final laboratory for understanding how mission-driven individuals can transform even total defeat into lasting victory. During the 6 years I spent in that remote exile, writing my memoirs and reflecting on everything I had achieved and lost, I discovered the 50th and most important principle. Your ultimate influence on history is determined not by the power you accumulate during your lifetime, but by the ideas and examples you leave for future generations to build upon. When the British deposited me on St. Helena in 1815, they believed they had finally solved the problem of Napoleon Bonaparte. I was thousands of miles from Europe, guarded by troops on an island from which escape was impossible, stripped of all political authority and military command. I would live out my remaining years as a curiosity, the former emperor, reduced to harmless irrelevance. What they failed to understand was that isolation from immediate political involvement would allow me to engage in the most important work of my entire career, transforming my lived experience into universal principles that could guide anyone seeking to change their world. The memoirs I dictated during those final years became more influential than any battle I had won or any empire I had ruled. This taught me that true, mission-driven leaders think beyond their personal timeline. The most important question isn't what you can accomplish during your own life, but what you can inspire others to accomplish long after you're gone. Legacy is created not through the accumulation of temporary power, but through the transmission of permanent wisdom. As I recounted my rise from Corsican artillery officer to Emperor of France, I began to see patterns that had been invisible while I was living through the experiences themselves. Every setback that had seemed devastating at the time had actually prepared me for opportunities that required exactly the capabilities that overcoming those setbacks had developed. Every victory that had seemed like validation had actually contained the seeds of future challenges that would test whether I could adapt my approach to changing circumstances. The young man reading this needs to understand something that took me decades to fully grasp. Your mission isn't about achieving specific positions or accumulating particular forms of recognition. Your mission is about developing yourself into the kind of person who can solve problems that matter, inspire others to exceed their perceived limitations, and leave the world measurably better than you found it. When I reflect on everything I accomplished, the military victories, the legal innovations, the institutional reforms, the cultural achievements, what I'm most proud of isn't any single achievement, but the demonstration that extraordinary results are possible when ordinary people commit themselves completely to purposes larger than personal comfort or conventional success. You live in a world that would be unrecognizable to the boy who left Corsica to attend military school in France. The technologies, the political systems, the economic structures, everything has changed, but the fundamental principles of mission-driven achievement remain exactly the same. Excellence creates opportunities. Preparation meets luck. Strategic thinking overcomes numerical disadvantages. Vision inspires others to attempt the impossible. The question you must answer is whether you will spend your life accepting the limitations that others try to impose on you, or whether you will act as if you're destined to change history. Because here's what I learned during 6 years of final reflection. Everyone who has ever accomplished anything significant has had to make this choice. The only difference between those who transform their world and those who merely inhabit it is the courage to act on mission-driven conviction. Your battlefield might be technology instead of territorial conquest. Your empire might be built from innovations instead of military victories. Your code might govern data instead of civil relationships. But the principles that will determine your success or failure are identical to those that determined mine. Start by developing unshakable competence in something that matters. Master the fundamentals so thoroughly that you can apply them instinctively when opportunities arise. Study the patterns of achievement in your field until you understand what separates exceptional performers from ordinary participants. Next, learn to see possibilities that others miss. The greatest opportunities are always disguised as problems that seem too difficult to solve. When everyone else is focusing on obstacles, train yourself to see potential solutions. When everyone else is accepting current limitations, ask yourself, what would become possible if those limitations were eliminated then? Develop the courage to act decisively when preparation meets opportunity. Most people spend their lives preparing for moments that they're too cautious to seize when those moments arrive. Mission-driven individuals understand that calculated risks are the price of exceptional achievement. Finally, And most importantly, build something that will outlast your personal involvement. The leaders who change history don't just achieve success, they create systems, institutions, and examples that enable others to achieve even greater success. Your ultimate victory isn't measured by what you accomplish, but by what you make possible for those who come after you. I spent my final years on St. Helena, transforming my experiences into wisdom that could guide future generations of mission-driven individuals. Now, it's your turn to decide whether you will join that ranks of people who refuse to accept mediocrity as inevitable. The world is waiting for someone with your unique combination of capabilities, circumstances, and opportunities to solve problems that haven't been solved yet. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is whether you're committed. The same fire that burned in a young Corsican artillery officer can burn in you if you're willing to act as if you're on a mission to change history, because you are.